Tom Malinowski is a friend, and I've been privileged to know him for many years. He is an extraordinary force in global human rights standards and norms. I did not know, candidly, Representative Malinowski, that you were an obsessive about supply chains and resilience in these systems. So can you, we've got about another week left in Congress, and you have served, you're going to be leaving Congress. What should we be doing this next week while you are still there, and even afterward, to seriously address in non-trivial ways the supply chain crisis in America?
Well, thanks, Steve. You all heard from my colleague Lisa Blunt Rochester. She and I, with Adam Kinzinger, tried to pass the supply chain resiliency provisions of the America Competes Act, and we have been trying to get some of that done in the last few weeks of Congress. I'm not super optimistic given how little time is left, but we do need, in my view, to build on the CHIPS Act with a much more ambitious set of measures to secure supply chains, not for, I don't particularly care if folks can't get their lawn chairs delivered from China in 48 hours, but things that are critical to our national security and to our economic security. I think we've learned some big lessons.
What would be some of the things on those lists that you do think are critical?
Well, microchips obviously is the big one that we've dealt with, but I would say anything having to do with energy security, anything having to do with our transition to clean energy, battery technology, the critical minerals that are required to pursue that transition. Ordinarily, I might not care about getting solar panels from China. But when those solar panels are linked to slave labor in Xinjiang, and when we have, I think dictatorship is a market failure. Mm-hmm. I'm a believer in free markets and free trade, but I don't believe that we can trust the dictator of China to do what is in the economic self-interest of China. And if there is a war in Taiwan, if there's another crisis between the United States and China, I don't think it is safe for us to be dependent on supply chains that begin in China for things that are critical to our security. Pharmaceutical ingredients. Almost all of the ingredients that are used to manufacture antibiotics in the United States come from China. Again, imagine a scenario where China invades Taiwan. Do we want to give them that leverage if we make the choice that we are going to make to defend Taiwan? You can believe in free markets and free trade, but the reality of the world is that there are these market failures where governments pursue interests that have nothing to do with their economic self-interest.
You have this quote that covers some of this. You say, we've learned many hard lessons during the pandemic. Among them, we should never be dependent on strategic adversaries like China for the goods we need to keep America safe and secure, whether it's PPE, whether it's protecting from disease, chips that power cars, computers, cell phones, so on, key materials in electric vehicles and solar panels, all of this stuff. You said that's what this bill was enabled us to do. When I looked last, and it's not all of the high-tech componentry there, but our trade with China is about $650 billion in two-way trade, I believe. And it's a staggeringly large amount, right? So, and I guess my question is, the shift in that, what's realistic in terms of turning the ship and bringing so much more of that commerce and production and manufacturing back to the United States in any real way? Because it is a huge number. And it would be, if you did bring that back, it would be an enormous economic input, I suppose, here. But I'm also looking at labor shortages in America, stresses. How do you do it rationally?
Well, in politics, we usually talk about bringing those jobs back to the United States. The reality is we can't bring all of those industries to the United States. We do need to think in terms of a coalition or alliance of countries that share our values, where we can have trust across frontiers that those countries are not going to screw us in a crisis, to be very, very blunt.
Right.
And so we are talking about North America, not just the United States of America. We are talking about Europe. We have some issues with the European Union right now that need to be worked out with respect to the energy provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think there are some legitimate concerns from our European partners there. But I do think, look, we have to buy ourselves as much time as possible to do this. We are, in a sense, in a race against time. I come back to the potential for a crisis between China and Taiwan, which might bring the United States into war with China. We hope it never happens. We hope we have time, if it does happen, before it happens, to secure as many of our critical supply chains as possible. But there's no time like the present to begin. You mentioned one other thing. You mentioned the labor market challenge. And again, this is something we do not talk about enough in the political sphere. Politicians love to talk about creating jobs. The infrastructure bill, I campaigned on millions of new jobs that are going to be created by the infrastructure bill. The CHIPS Act, obviously, the IRA, bringing all of this clean energy manufacturing back to the United States. What we very rarely acknowledge in the political sphere is that we just don't have enough people to do these jobs in the United States. And there are only two possible solutions to that problem. One is scientists figure out a way to grow workers in less than 18 years. The second is comprehensive immigration reform. And going back to the vision of America that used to be shared by Democrats and Republicans like Ronald Reagan, that we are a place that is open to those with dreams and visions of living a better future and freedom. And we have had almost a complete shutdown in immigration to this country because of the Trump administration's policies and then the pandemic over the last 5 or 6 years.
So is that a blind spot of the Biden team that they haven't fixed that?
Well, I think they would agree with me.
Why are they moving so slowly?
Congress, right now, there is a total and absolute block in the United States Senate, courtesy of one senator, Charles Grassley, of any provision in any bill related to anything having to do with immigration. Even things that you think Republicans would be in favor of, like I've got legislation that would make it easier for people fleeing the Chinese Communist Party from Hong Kong to come to the United States. It would be a few thousand people. I can't get that done. The Afghan Adjustment Act. Republicans criticized the Biden administration for not doing enough fast enough to help Afghans who are fleeing the Taliban, and yet they refuse to allow us to pass that bill because of an ideological
This is even people that are translated, the SIVs.
Everything.
Right? Yeah.
No, there is simply no category. There's no provision related to immigration that can pass this ideological blockade.
Right.
And that even applies to a few hundred people, a few thousand people, to actually get the immigration reform that would enable millions of people in the United States to work legally who are here now. The number one thing, by the way, we could do to cure inflation would be immigration reform. It's politically almost impossible. And so one of my missions in life, which I hope all of you will help with, is to make immigration an economic security issue again.
Is that your next chapter?
I have no idea what my next chapter is.
Okay.
Well, we all need to be part of that chapter.
Well, great. Well, let me. I'm going to take a question from Harry Broadman, who we had talked earlier about this, but we're going to make this quick question, quick answer. Go ahead, Harry.
Thanks very much. I'm really delighted you had this meeting. I'm one of these few people who has been obsessed about supply chains and logistics for 2 or 3 decades. I was the lead U.S. negotiator for the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which probably none of you remember, but
Right.
that governs the trade and investment in services.
Right.
And that brings me to the point I think we should underline in this conversation is it's not just the pandemic that has engendered this issue. Right? The industry has been changing. And one of the issues, someone mentioned about pushing a button, you expect your goods. One of the issues, I'm an economist, right? So I think about in terms of pricing is, are we pricing things correctly?
Right.
Are we sending the right signals? So should we be willing to take a greater discount if it took a week for Amazon to ship you something as opposed to tomorrow? So these are fundamental issues, not just related to the pandemic.
Right. Thank you, Harry. Comments on this, and one of the things that Harry just said about pricing is when I worked in the Senate in the 1990s, and I think it's around the time I first met you for Jeff Bingaman, there were senators at that time, there were people like Clyde Preskowitz raising big questions about trade dependencies, about institutions and global governance on trade, China and its course. And I have to tell you that everything we raised back then was roundly ignored by the Clinton administration in the middle of this. And I kind of look back at who's liable for the circumstances we have today. And I can name names and make a list. And they were Republicans and Democrats where we're at now. And I'm just interested in whether or not, as we look to fix this, this has been baking for decades, and to come to Harry's point. So my question to you is, you know, as we talk about this and try to be responsible, should we be even talking about quick fixes? And we'll make this the final question.
About quick fixes? I mean, there are no quick fix. In a way, the quickest fix is what I was just talking about. That is actually the quickest, most consequential thing we could do to deal with inflation and supply chains. Because we have this massive workforce here, which is undocumented, and desperate to become taxpayers, desperate to become fully fledged American citizens, contributing to our country, and many, many more waiting in the wings. Going back to, I was in the Clinton administration. I wrote President Clinton's speeches arguing for bringing China into the World Trade Organization. And
I remember them.
Yes, they were great speeches. Look, there was a gamble that was based on the idea that if you bring this country into a rules-based system, that it would change, and that turned out to be false. That turned out to be not true. There is a broader mistake I think we tend to make as Americans dealing with dictatorships around the world. We project our own rationality onto them. We assume that just as we would not utterly destroy our own economy by doing something crazy like invading a country in a way that would break all of our international relationships, that Xi Jinping would not do the same thing. Look at what Putin just did with respect to Ukraine. It's economically irrational, but it is rational from his point of view as someone with a messianic sense that I'm going to rebuild the former Soviet Union. And I think we have kind of begun to come to terms with that a little bit more, like recognizing that, China could do what Xi Jinping clearly wants to do to Taiwan, despite the economic consequences, and therefore we have to be prepared.
Well, can I just say on behalf of Congressman Tom Malinowski, who's going to be retiring from Congress in just a few days, can I just say thank you for always coming when I ask for your friendship, your leadership, and I know you will not be stopping on a lot of these topics in your next chapter. So Tom Malinowski, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.